Part 1. The wedding of my dreams, or so I thought. The day of my wedding was like something out of a fairy tale. The old chapel was decorated with cascading white roses, their sweet fragrance mingling with the soft melody of the string quartet. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, bathing the room in a warm, ethereal glow. Every detail was perfect, the culmination of months of meticulous planning. And at the center of it all was Daniel, my soon-to-be husband. Standing at the altar in his tailored navy suit, his dark hair perfectly styled, he looked at me like I was the only person in the world. My heart swelled with love and anticipation. Walking down the aisle, I felt like I was floating, every step taking me closer to the man I believed would be my forever. My sister, Melissa, was beside me as my maid of honor. She looked radiant in her lavender gown, a picture of poise and grace. Melissa had always been my biggest cheerleader, my confidant through thick and thin. It felt right to have her standing by my side on this monumental day. As Daniel and I exchanged vows, I couldn't help but glance at Melissa. She was beaming, her hands clasped together in a gesture of excitement. I felt a pang of gratitude. Her support meant everything to me. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, the chapel erupted in applause, and I kissed Daniel with all the love and hope in my heart. This was it, I thought. The start of our happily ever after. The reception was as magical as the ceremony. The courtyard twinkled with string lights, and the soft hum of laughter and clinking glasses filled the air. Daniel and I made our rounds, thanking our guests and basking in the glow of their well wishes. Melissa was everywhere, her laughter ringing out as she charmed everyone she spoke to. At one point I spotted her at the bar with Daniel. Their heads were close together, and they were laughing about something I couldn't hear. The sight struck me as odd, too intimate maybe? But I quickly brushed the thought aside. Melissa had always been bubbly and outgoing, and Daniel had always been kind and friendly. Later, during her toast, Melissa had everyone in stitches as she recounted childhood stories of our sisterly misadventures. But when she turned her attention to Daniel, her tone shifted. "Daniel," she said, raising her glass, "I've never seen Claire as happy as she is with you. You're not just her partner. You're her world. And from what I've seen, she's yours too." The room erupted in cheers and I blinked back tears. It was a beautiful sentiment, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of emotion I couldn't quite place. As the night went on, I noticed Daniel and Melissa sharing more moments. Quiet conversations at the edge of the crowd, a shared laugh over a spilled drink, the way his hand briefly touched her arm. It was subtle, and if I hadn't been looking, I might have missed it. By the time we left the reception, waving goodbye to our guests from the back of the vintage car, I couldn't shake the unease. Melissa stood at the edge of the crowd, her smile not quite reaching her eyes as she waved us off. I told myself I was imagining things. I had just married the man of my dreams, and Melissa was my sister, my best friend. There was no reason to doubt either of them. But as Daniel squeezed my hand and kissed my cheek, promising me forever, the strange weight in my chest remained. Little did I know, the happily ever after I had dreamed of was already beginning to unravel. Part 2. Honeymoon Shadows. The Maldives was everything I dreamed it would be. An island paradise with crystal-clear waters, soft white sands, and sunsets that painted the sky in vibrant shades of orange and pink. Our overwater villa felt like a private haven, a perfect escape from the rest of the world. This was supposed to be the start of our forever, a blissful honeymoon with nothing to distract us from each other. But something felt off. At first, I tried to dismiss it as the natural shift from wedding adrenaline to post-celebration calm. Daniel seemed relaxed, lounging in the hammock on our villa deck with a book in hand or diving into the turquoise waters below. He was attentive too, ordering my favorite drinks, taking photos of me against the stunning backdrops, and pulling me close for kisses that felt genuine. And yet, there were moments that gave me pause. It started small. On our second night, as we enjoyed a romantic candlelit dinner on the beach, Daniel's phone buzzed. He glanced at it quickly, his lips twitching into a faint smile before placing the phone face down on the table. "Who's texting you all the way out here?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "Oh, it's just Melissa," he said casually, taking a sip of his wine. "She wanted to make sure we're having a good time." I laughed softly, trying to push down the tiny prickle of doubt. Of course Melissa would check in. She'd been so involved in planning the wedding and cared about both of us deeply. But as the night went on, Daniel seemed distracted. His phone buzzed a few more times, and each time he glanced at it, a flicker of emotion crossed his face. one I couldn't quite decipher. The next day, as we lounged by the infinity pool overlooking the ocean, his phone buzzed again. This time I caught a glimpse of the screen. Melissa. I felt my stomach tighten. What's she saying now? I asked, forcing a smile. Oh, just some silly family stuff, he replied, locking his phone and setting it aside. Nothing important. I nodded, but a seed of unease had already taken root. Why was she texting so often? Why was he so quick to dismiss it? By the fourth day, the interruptions became impossible to ignore. We were kayaking in the lagoon, the sun glinting off the water when his phone buzzed again. He didn't even try to hide it this time, paddling to the shore to check his messages while I floated awkwardly, pretending not to notice. When we got back to the villa, I finally decided to say something. Daniel. I began, keeping my voice steady. Why is Melissa texting you so much? It feels unusual. He hesitated, glancing at his phone on the table before meeting my gaze. It's nothing, Claire. You're overthinking it. She just wants to stay connected. You know how close we all are. His words were reasonable, but the way he said them wasn't. His tone was defensive, his expression tight. I let it go for the moment, unwilling to ruin what should have been a happy time. But the tension didn't fade. That night, as he slept soundly beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The doubt in my mind grew louder with every passing hour. On the fifth day, the tipping point came. While Daniel was in the shower, I noticed his phone light up on the nightstand. My heart raced as I leaned over to check the notification. Melissa. Did you tell her yet? My blood ran cold. What was there to tell? I heard the water stop and quickly placed the phone back where it was, my hands trembling as I sat on the edge of the bed. When Daniel came out, towel slung over his shoulders, I forced a smile, pretending nothing was wrong. But inside, my mind was spinning. Over the next few days, I watched him more closely than ever, searching for clues in his behavior, his words, even his tone. He seemed normal, affectionate, attentive, like the Daniel I knew and loved. And yet, the message from Melissa haunted me. Did he notice the way my smiles faltered? Did he sense the distance growing between us? If he did, he didn't let on. As our honeymoon drew to a close, I couldn't shake the feeling that the dream I'd been living wasn't as perfect as it seemed. Something was lurking beneath the surface, something I wasn't sure I was ready to uncover. But I knew one thing for certain. My marriage was already beginning to feel like a fragile glass, and it wouldn't take much to shatter it. Part 3, Cracks Beneath the Surface. Coming back from the honeymoon should have been the start of a new chapter. Instead, it felt like something was slipping out of place just beyond my grasp. Daniel returned to work with a renewed focus, throwing himself into long days and late nights. At first, I attributed it to his drive to provide for us, but the growing distance between us was hard to ignore. Melissa, who had always been my anchor, was suddenly unreachable. Days passed without a call or text from her. When I finally reached out, her voice was strained and unfamiliar. Hey Melissa, I said, forcing cheerfulness. I've missed you. How are you? I've been busy, she replied curtly. You know how it is. It wasn't like her. Melissa was always the first to reach out, always full of enthusiasm about every detail of my life. Her coldness stung, but I pushed the thoughts away, telling myself I was imagining things. Daniel's absences grew more frequent. One evening, hoping to surprise him, I prepared his favorite meal and lit candles, trying to recreate the magic of our honeymoon. I texted to ask when he'd be home, and his reply came quickly. Might be late. Don't wait up. I stared at the table, the candles flickering against untouched plates. The knot in my stomach tightened, but I still clung to denial. The cafe encounter. The next Saturday, I decided to shake off my doubts with some errands downtown. Passing a small cafe, I saw a familiar figure through the window. Daniel. My heart lifted for a moment, thinking I could surprise him. But then I saw who he was with. Melissa sat across from him, her back to me, her posture relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in weeks. Daniel leaned in close, smiling in that effortless way that used to be reserved for me. Then I saw his hand reach across the table, brushing hers. His fingers lingered. My world tilted. I froze on the sidewalk, unable to process what I was seeing. They were deep in conversation, oblivious to the world around them or to me. My chest tightened as I ducked into a nearby shop, peering through the window like an outsider to my own life. When they finally left the cafe, walking side by side, their shoulders brushed in a way that made my stomach churn. They looked comfortable. Familiar in a way that sent a cold wave of realization washing over me. A shaky alibi. That evening, Daniel came home as if nothing had happened. He kissed my forehead, murmured something about a long day at work, and poured himself a glass of wine. Busy day? I asked, keeping my tone even. Same old, he replied, settling into the couch without elaborating. I watched him carefully, waiting for him to mention the cafe, to explain why he'd been with Melissa. But he didn't. Later, unable to shake the scene from my mind, I called Melissa. Hey, I said, keeping my voice casual. I saw Daniel downtown today. Were you with him? There was a pause too long. Oh, yeah, she said finally. He asked me to help him pick something out for you. A surprise. A surprise. I asked, my chest tightening. What kind of surprise? I don't know, she stammered. You'll see soon enough. Her voice wavered and I knew she was lying. Before I could press further, she rushed off the phone with a flimsy excuse, leaving me staring at the screen. The growing cracks. Over the next few days I tried to act normal, but the distance between Daniel and me felt insurmountable. The weight of unspoken truths lingered in the air. He continued his late nights, brushing off my questions with practiced ease. Melissa grew even more distant, her once frequent texts dwindling to nothing. The two people I trusted most were slipping away from me, and I couldn't understand why. Each time I saw Daniel's phone light up with a message or caught him glancing at his screen with a faint smile, my heart ached. Every unanswered question, every vague explanation, added to the growing cracks in my life. I wanted to confront them, to demand answers. But fear held me back. Fear of what I might uncover. Fear that the life I thought I was building had already begun to crumble. Deep down I knew the truth was coming, whether I was ready for it or not. The cracks were too deep now, and it was only a matter of time before everything shattered. Why do you think Daniel and Melissa crossed the boundaries they did, despite their close connection to Claire? Write your answer in comments. Part 4. The Discovery. The days after the cafe encounter were some of the most confusing of my life. I couldn't shake the image of Daniel and Melissa. Their heads close, their laughter shared, his hand brushing hers. It replayed in my mind on a loop, each detail sharper and more painful than the last. I wanted to confront them both immediately, but fear held me back. Fear of what I might uncover, fear of being wrong. Daniel continued his late nights, brushing off my questions with vague excuses about work. Melissa remained distant, her calls short and evasive. I was stuck in a limbo of doubt and suspicion, feeling the ground beneath my marriage shift with every passing day. One evening, when Daniel came home late again, I decided I couldn't sit in the shadows any longer. While he slept, I picked up his phone from the nightstand, my hands trembling as I entered his passcode. My heart pounded as I scrolled through his messages, but nothing in his recent texts seemed out of place. For a moment I felt a flicker of relief, until I noticed a hidden folder in his photo gallery. I hesitated, my breath catching in my throat. With a swipe, the folder opened, revealing a series of pictures that made my stomach drop. They were selfies of Melissa and Daniel, smiling at a cafe table. Melissa in a dress I hadn't seen her wear, standing in front of a mirror while Daniel's reflection snapped the picture. The intimacy in their poses was unmistakable, and I felt the air leave my lungs. The confrontation. The next morning, I decided to confront Daniel. I sat in the living room, his phone on the coffee table, waiting for him to wake up. When he walked in, groggy and unsuspecting, he froze at the sight of me, the phone, and my expression. "We need to talk," I said, my voice trembling. "What's this about?" he asked cautiously, his eyes flicking to the phone. "I found your hidden photos," I said, tears already welling up. "Pictures of you and Melissa. Smiling, laughing like you're on some secret getaway together. Do you want to explain what's going on?" For a moment his face was blank, then panic set in. "Claire, it's not what it looks like. Don't lie to me," I snapped, my voice cracking. "I saw the way you two were in those pictures. I saw the way you looked at her in the cafe. I've seen how you've been sneaking around. I deserved the truth, Daniel." He sank into the chair across from me, his head in his hands. "It wasn't supposed to happen," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What wasn't supposed to happen?" I pressed, my anger boiling over. "It started after the wedding," he admitted, his voice shaky. "We were talking more, texting. First it was innocent, I swear. But then," he trailed off, his words hanging in the air like a dagger. "Then what?" I demanded, tears streaming down my face. Then I realized I had feelings for her. He said finally, his voice breaking. I didn't mean for it to happen, Claire. I didn't want to hurt you. His confession hit me like a freight train. My husband, the man who had vowed to love me forever, had fallen for my own sister. A second betrayal. As if Daniel's confession wasn't enough, I knew I needed to confront Melissa too. My hand shook as I dialed her number, the betrayal fresh and raw. When she picked up, her voice was hesitant. Claire, we need to talk, I said, my tone sharp. I know about you and Daniel. There was a long silence, and then Melissa let out a shaky breath. Claire, I didn't mean for it to happen. Don't, I interrupted. Don't tell me you didn't mean for this. How could you? You're my sister. How could you do this to me? Her voice broke as she began to cry. I'm so sorry. I didn't want to hurt you, but I couldn't stop how I felt. I didn't plan this. Her words felt like knives. So you didn't plan it. Does that make it okay? Does that erase the fact that you've been sneaking around with my husband? I love him, she said, her voice barely audible. That was it. The final nail in the coffin of our relationship. I hung up without another word, my world crumbling around me. The fallout. That evening, I told Daniel to pack his things and leave. Watching him gather his belongings was surreal. The man I once loved, now a stranger who had betrayed me in the worst possible way. He tried to apologize, but I couldn't bear to hear it. As he walked out the door, I collapsed onto the couch, the weight of the day pressing down on me. Melissa was gone from my life too. Her betrayal cutting even deeper than Daniel's. I was left with nothing but the shards of a life I thought I knew, unsure of how I would ever put myself back together. But one thing was clear. I couldn't stay in the shadows any longer. I had seen the truth, and now I had to find a way to survive it. How do you think Claire managed to find the strength to move forward after such a betrayal? Write your answer in the comments. Part 5, The Shattered Foundation. The hours after Daniel walked out were a haze of disbelief and heartache. The silence in the house felt suffocating, as if the walls themselves were mourning the life I thought I had. The man I'd built my future with was gone, not just from my home but from the pedestal I'd unknowingly placed him on. My sister, my confidant, the person who had stood beside me at the altar, had betrayed me in a way I never imagined possible. I spent that first night on the couch, staring at the ceiling and replaying every memory with Daniel and Melissa. When had it started? Was it at the wedding, during those stolen moments I'd brushed off as innocent? Or had it been before, while we were planning the ceremony, and I was too busy choosing flower arrangements to notice? The next morning I woke to dozens of unread messages on my phone. Apologies from Daniel, pleas for forgiveness from Melissa, and a string of confused texts from my mother, who had caught wind that something was wrong. I ignored them all, unable to face the storm brewing outside the fragile shell of my grief. Melissa's desperation. Melissa wasn't one to give up easily. By the third day, she showed up unannounced at my doorstep, her face pale and tear-streaked. Claire, please, she begged as I opened the door. You have to let me explain. There's nothing to explain, I said coldly, gripping the doorframe to keep myself steady. You fell in love with my husband. You betrayed me. What else is there to say? Tears streamed down her face as she clasped her hands together. I know I hurt you. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know that it wasn't planned. I didn't mean for this to happen. Her words only deepened my anger. Stop saying it wasn't planned. You didn't accidentally sneak around with Daniel. You didn't accidentally lie to me for months. You made choices, Melissa. Choices that destroyed everything. She flinched but didn't back down. I never wanted to hurt you, Claire, she said, her voice trembling. But I couldn't ignore how I felt. And neither could he. Her audacity stunned me into silence for a moment. I stared at her, the sister I had trusted my entire life, now reduced to a stranger. How you felt? I spat. What about how I feel? Did you even think about me? About the vows Daniel and I made? Or were your feelings all that mattered? I think about you every second, she said, her voice breaking. I hate myself for this. I hate that I ruined everything. But Claire, I love him. Her confession was a dagger to the heart. I stepped back, my vision blurring with tears. Get out, I said, my voice low but firm. Claire, get out, I screamed, slamming the door in her face. The public fallout. News of the betrayal spread quickly through our family. My mother called incessantly, desperate to mediate, while my father, ever the stoic, sent a curt text. I'm sorry, Claire. I don't know what to say. The most painful part was navigating the questions from friends who hadn't yet heard the truth. People asked innocently about the honeymoon, how married life was treating us. Each time I felt the ground beneath me shake as I struggled to respond. One afternoon, a mutual friend texted me. Hey, is it true about Daniel and Melissa? I don't want to believe it, but the humiliation was unbearable. I wasn't just grieving the loss of my husband and my sister. I was mourning the life I thought I had. The image of a happy couple and a close-knit family that had crumbled in the eyes of everyone who knew us. Daniel's return. A week after he left, Daniel came back. I heard his car pull into the driveway and froze, my heart pounding as he knocked on the door. Claire, it's me, he called, his voice soft. Can we talk? I didn't want to see him, but curiosity, or maybe anger, got the better of me. I opened the door to find him standing there, looking disheveled and hollow-eyed. What do you want, Daniel? I asked, my tone cold. To apologize, he said, his voice breaking. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know how sorry I am. For everything. I crossed my arms, unwilling to let his words penetrate the fortress I'd built around my heart. You're not sorry for what you did, I said. You're sorry you got caught. He flinched, but I didn't stop. You didn't just betray me. You humiliated me. You made a mockery of our marriage, of everything we built together. Do you have any idea how that feels? He nodded, tears welling in his eyes. I know I hurt you, he said. I hate myself for it. But Claire, it wasn't just an affair. I love her. Hearing those words again felt like being gutted. I turned away, unable to look at him. Then go, I said, my voice shaking. If you love her, go. But don't you dare come back here. Daniel hesitated, as if he wanted to say more, but eventually, he turned and walked away. As his car disappeared down the street, I collapsed onto the couch, tears streaming down my face. The turning point. That night I stared at my reflection in the mirror, my face pale and my eyes red-rimmed. I hardly recognized the woman staring back at me. But beneath the pain, a spark of resolve began to grow. Daniel and Melissa had taken so much from me. My trust, my happiness, my sense of security. But they hadn't taken me. I was still here, and I wasn't going to let them define the rest of my life. I wasn't sure how I was going to rebuild, but I knew one thing for certain. I was stronger than they thought. And no matter how long it took, I would find a way to rise from the ashes of their betrayal. Part 6: Rising from the Ashes. The days following Daniel's final departure were some of the hardest of my life. The house felt like a mausoleum, a shell filled with memories of a life I could no longer claim. Every corner seemed haunted by echoes of laughter, promises, and love that now felt like a cruel joke. Yet, amidst the overwhelming pain, a quiet determination began to grow. I refused to let this betrayal break me. They had taken enough. I started small. I cleared the house of anything that reminded me of Daniel, his clothes, the framed photos of our wedding, even the mug he always used for his morning coffee. Each item I packed into a box felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. The house was emptier without his things, but it also felt lighter, as if I was slowly peeling away the layers of his betrayal. Reclaiming myself. Rebuilding wasn't easy. Some days I felt as though I was making progress, throwing myself into work, going on long runs to clear my head, and reconnecting with friends who rallied around me like a protective shield. Other days I'd crumble, unable to stop the flood of memories or the relentless question that haunted me. How could they? Therapy became a lifeline. My therapist helped me unpack the weight of betrayal, guiding me through the tangled web of anger, grief, and self-doubt. She reminded me that their actions didn't define me, that my worth wasn't tied to their choices. Slowly I began to believe her. One afternoon I found myself staring at an old photo of Melissa and me as kids, arms slung around each other, grinning from ear to ear. I felt a pang of longing for the sister I'd lost, not just to betrayal, but to the person she'd become. But then I reminded myself that I hadn't lost her. She had thrown away our bond for something fleeting. And while I mourned the relationship we'd had, I knew I couldn't let her back into my life. The unexpected encounter. Weeks later I was at a local cafe, nursing a latte and working through a stack of papers for work, when I heard a voice behind me that sent a chill down my spine. Claire. I turned to see Melissa standing there, her face pale, her eyes wide with surprise. She looked thinner, more tired. as if the weight of her choices had finally caught up to her. "What do you want, Melissa?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "I didn't know you'd be here," she said softly. She hesitated, then took a cautious step closer. "Can I sit down?" I stared at her for a moment, torn between anger and curiosity. Against my better judgment, I nodded. She sat across from me, fiddling nervously with the edge of her sleeve. "I've been trying to reach you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know," I replied, my tone cold. "I've been ignoring you." She flinched but continued. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. I know I ruined everything, and I hate myself for it." Her words hung in the air, but they didn't have the impact she seemed to hope for. I looked at her, this woman who had once been my closest ally, and felt nothing but a hollow ache. "Melissa," I said quietly, "you didn't just ruin my marriage. You destroyed our family. You betrayed me in the worst way possible. And now you want forgiveness." Tears welled in her eyes. "I don't deserve it. I know I don't, but I needed to tell you that I regret everything. Daniel and we're not even together anymore." It fell apart. The revelation didn't surprise me. Whatever they'd had, it had been built on lies and deceit. Of course it hadn't lasted. "I don't care about you and Daniel," I said firmly. "I care about me, and I'm finally moving on. I don't need your apology, Melissa. I just need you to leave me alone." She nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face, and stood to leave. As I watched her walk away, I felt a strange sense of closure. She was no longer a part of my life, and I was finally okay with that. Moving forward. In the months that followed, I focused on rebuilding myself. I redecorated the house, turning it into a space that reflected who I was. Not who I'd been with Daniel. I started attending yoga classes, where I found a surprising sense of peace. I even joined a book club, where I met new people who didn't know me as the woman whose husband left her for her sister. It was refreshing to exist outside the shadow of that story, to rediscover parts of myself that had been buried under the weight of betrayal. One evening, as I sat on my newly decorated balcony, sipping a glass of wine and watching the city lights twinkle, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I was ready for it. I wasn't the same person I'd been on my wedding day, but I was stronger, wiser, and more in tune with what I deserved. Daniel and Melissa had broken my trust, but they hadn't broken me. And as I gazed out at the world before me, I realized I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. Final reflection. This chapter of my life had been painful, but it had also been transformative. I had learned to let go of people who didn't value me, to set boundaries that protected my peace, and to trust in my own resilience. Melissa and Daniel were part of my past, but they no longer defined my present. I had reclaimed my story, and I was finally free to write a new one on my own terms. How would you have handled the confrontation if you were in Claire's shoes?